Let me take you back. Not to the port, not to the chaos of that day, but to the beginning. To the moment the dream was born. Because you have to understand, this wasn't just a trip. It wasn't a simple vacation. For me, it was a lifeline. It was late February. You know that time of year? Where the world outside your window is just shades of gray. The sky is a slab of slate. The trees are skeletal black fingers against it. And the snow that was once pristine in December is now a dirty, slushy afterthought, piled up in the corners of parking lots. It feels like the color has been leached out of everything, including you. That was our world. And inside our house, the silence had become a physical presence. It was this heavy, cold thing that settled in the rooms, in the spaces between us on the couch, in the pauses during a conversation that once would have been filled with easy laughter. Mark and I, we were like two satellites orbiting the same planet, but on completely different paths, passing in the night with a faint, silent blink. Our conversations had become a checklist of logistics. Did you call the plumber about the dripping faucet? Your mother called. What do you want for dinner? I don't know, whatever you want. We were functioning, but we weren't connecting. The warmth, the shared jokes, the simple act of looking at each other and just knowing what the other was thinking. It had been buried under a mountain of daily grind, of work stress, of years of assuming the other would just always be there. I felt a profound loneliness, the kind that's amplified because you're not actually alone. You're sitting right next to the person who is supposed to be your partner, your best friend, and you feel a million miles away. And then it arrived. In our icy mailbox, surrounded by bills and generic advertising flyers, was this one, stunningly out-of-place envelope. It was a rich, creamy color, and my name was written in an elegant, swirling font. Felt expensive. Felt important. I opened it right there, my fingers cold and clumsy. And inside, it was like a burst of captured sunlight. It was a brochure for the MS Azura Serenade. The name itself sounded like a promise. Serenade. I took it inside, poured a cup of coffee, and sat at the kitchen table, the gray light filtering through the window. And I fell into it. I truly, completely fell into those pages. This wasn't just a ship. It was a floating palace. The photography was so vivid I could almost hear the sounds. The main deck was a vast expanse of gleaming teak wood surrounding a pool of water so brilliantly, impossibly blue it looked like a sapphire. Not a single leaf, not a single piece of clutter marred the scene. Happy, smiling couples. Not models, they looked like real people. Toasted with glasses of champagne that bubbled with pure joy. Their laughter was almost audible. I turned the page. A 5-star restaurant with white linen tablecloths, waiters in crisp tuxedos, and plates of food that were works of art. Lobster tails gleaming, steaks perfectly seared, desserts that looked like delicate sculptures. Next page, a spa. The Sanctum, it was called. Women with serene smiles, wrapped in fluffy white robes, receiving massages as they looked out at an endless ocean. The caption read, "Leave the world behind." I kept turning. A Broadway-style theater with plush red velvet seats. A jazz club, intimate and dark, with a saxophonist lost in his music. A quiet library with leather armchairs, perfect for curling up with a book as the ocean glided past a floor-to-ceiling window. And the destinations. Grand Cayman. The water was so clear you could see stingrays gliding over white sand like underwater birds. Ocho Rios, Jamaica, with its lush, emerald-green mountains tumbling down into the sea. A private beach club in Cozumel, with hammocks strung between palm trees and a waiter asking if you'd like another coconut drink. I wasn't just looking at pictures. I was constructing a reality. I could feel the tropical sun, so different from the weak winter light in my kitchen, warming my skin down to my bones. I could taste the salt spray on my lips. I could hear the gentle lapping of waves against the hull, the calypso music from the deck, the sound of genuine, unfettered laughter coming from my own mouth. I could see Mark and I, dressed in white, dancing under a canopy of a million stars, his hand on the small of my back, the distance between us finally, completely gone. We'd remember who we were before the mortgage, the demanding jobs, the quiet exhaustion. This trip, this Azure Serenade, was going to be our reset button. It was the magic wand that would wipe the slate clean of all the resentment, all the silence, all the cold. It was the answer. It was our 7-day escape from the gray, and I was certain, with every fiber of my being, that it would bring the color back, not just to the world, but to us. It was no longer a want. It was a need, a desperate, aching need for light and warmth, and I became absolutely determined to make it happen. This dream was going to become our reality. Of course, let's continue building this emotional journey, moving from the dream into the unsettling reality that began to crack its perfect surface. You have to understand, the dream of the Azure Serenade didn't exist in a vacuum. It grew, like a beautiful but desperate weed, in the fertile soil of our quiet discontent. To make you feel why this trip meant everything, I need to pull back the curtain on what our life had really become. It's not about dramatic fights or slammed doors. Those you can fix. This was quieter, slower, and in many ways so much more dangerous. It was the slow leak you don't hear that eventually sinks the entire ship. If our marriage in the early years was a vibrant, rushing river, full of energy, carving new paths together, tumbling over rocks with laughter, then what we had become was a wide, still lake. Calm on the surface, but stagnant underneath. The water was so still it had become a perfect mirror, and we were only ever looking at our own reflections, our own individual worries, instead of looking through it to see each other. Our conversations were the first clue. Do you know what we talked about? We talked about things. We talked about the leaky faucet. We talked about the weird noise the car was making. We talked about whether we should get the gutters cleaned. We talked about the grocery list. What we didn't talk about were ideas. We didn't talk about that documentary we saw and what it made us feel. We didn't talk about the book I was reading and the worlds it opened up. We didn't reminisce about that ridiculously cheap, awful hotel we stayed in on our first trip to the coast and how we laughed all night. Those conversations had dried up, replaced by a functional, domestic shorthand that took care of business but starved our souls. We were a team of managers, running the small corporation of our life incorporated. We were efficient, we were effective, and we were profoundly lonely. I try sometimes. I'd come home buzzing about a project I was passionate about, the words tumbling out of me, and I'd see his eyes glaze over just a little. He'd nod, say, "That's great, honey," and then his phone would buzz with a work email, and that was it. The door to that connection would close. The silence would rush back in. It wasn't malicious. It wasn't mean. It was just absent. His mind was always elsewhere, buried in spreadsheets and project timelines and the immense pressure he was under at work. Pressure he internalized, pressure he stopped sharing with me. I'd find myself watching him sometimes from across the room. He'd be staring at the TV, but his eyes were unfocused miles away. I'd wonder, asterisk, what are you thinking about? Are you in there? Asterisk, the man I married, the one with the easy laugh who could build entire worlds of imagination out of a simple walk in the park, seemed to have receded deep inside himself, and I didn't know how to reach him anymore. I felt like I was living with a pleasant, kind-hearted stranger who wore my husband's face. The coldness outside our window seemed to have seeped into the very bones of our house. The warmth came from the furnace, not from us. We'd go to bed at the same time, read for a bit, say good night, and turn out the lights. And in that darkness, the space between us in that king-sized bed felt like a canyon. I'd listen to his breathing even out, and my heart would ache with a longing for just a simple touch. Not even a passionate one. Just a hand reaching out in the dark to find mine. A silent reassurance that said, "I'm here, we're still us." That brochure, the Azure Serenade, became my answer to that silence. I convinced myself that all we needed was to be ripped out of our gray, frozen context. We needed to be placed in a new world of brilliant color and sensory overload, where the only agenda was pleasure and the only decision was whether to have the lobster or the steak. Surrounded by that blue, endless ocean, with no laundry to do, no emails to check, no gutters to clean, we would have no choice but to finally look at each other again. We would remember the people we were before the weight of the world settled on our shoulders. The trip was the catalyst. It was the magic trick. I invested all my hope for saving us into those 7 days, pinning everything on a fantasy of sun-drenched reconciliation. I believed with my whole heart that if we could just get on that ship, everything would be okay. The morning we were supposed to leave dawned not with the brilliant sunrise I'd imagined, but with the same flat, pewter-gray light that had characterized the entire winter. It felt like a bad omen, but I was too determined, too invested in the fantasy to pay it any mind. I was a woman on a mission, buzzing around our bedroom with a kind of frantic, forced energy, folding the last of my sundresses. A splash of defiant floral print against the gloom outside the window. I had curated my suitcase like an artist preparing for a gallery opening. Every item was chosen not just for function, but for symbolism. The emerald green bikini for the woman who was bold and confident. The flowing white kaftan for elegant evenings on the deck. The strappy sandals for dancing. I was packing a version of myself I desperately wanted to become again. The fun, carefree, desirable woman I felt I'd lost somewhere between grocery runs and mortgage payments. Mark, on the other hand, moved through the morning like a man walking through wet cement. His packing was haphazard, thrown together at the last minute. He'd stare into his closet for minutes on end, as if the simple act of choosing a shirt was a monumental decision. When I chirped, "Don't forget your swim trunks. The water will be amazing," he just grunted, a non-committal sound from deep in his throat, and tossed a pair of old khaki shorts into his bag. "You okay?" I asked, my voice a little too bright, trying to paper over the cracks I could already feel widening. "Just a bit of a headache," he muttered, not meeting my eyes. "Maybe something I ate last night." But it felt like more than a headache. It was a heaviness that clung to him, a dark cloud trailing in his wake. I chose to ignore it. I told myself it was just pre-travel jitters, the stress of leaving work behind. I poured him some extra coffee, my cheerfulness becoming a shield against his silence. The drive to the port was a study in dissonance. Inside the car, the silence was so thick you could almost touch it. It was a physical wall between us in the front seat. I had the radio on, tuned to a upbeat station playing tropical-themed songs, Kokomo, Margaritaville. The irony was almost painful. I sang along a little, tapping my fingers on the window ledge, trying to conjure the mood through sheer force of will. "Look, Mark, the sun's trying to come out," I'd say, pointing at a faint, lighter patch in the gray sky. He'd reply, his eyes never leaving the road ahead. I printed the excursion tickets. The Stingray City tour is supposed to be unforgettable. That's good. Each of my attempts at conversation landed with a dull thud and died. My excitement, with no one to receive it, began to curdle into a nervous, brittle anxiety. What if this was a mistake? What if we got all the way there and the silence just continued, but now against a backdrop of other people's happiness? The seed of doubt was planted, but I ruthlessly squashed it. No. The ship will fix this. The sun will fix this. Then we saw it, the port, and for a glorious, heart-lifting moment, my hope was vindicated. It was a sensory explosion that blasted away the quiet anxiety of the car. It was a carnival of color and sound and pure, unadulterated joy. The Azura Serenade itself was breathtaking. A colossal, pristine white giant, towering over the terminal, its hull a striking navy blue. Flags snapped in the breeze. People everywhere were laughing, waving, wearing ridiculous flower leis and big sun hats. The energy was electric, infectious. You could feel the collective anticipation of 1,000 stories about to begin. I grabbed Mark's arm. "Look, there she is. Isn't she beautiful?" For the first time that day, I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Not quite excitement, but maybe awareness. The sheer scale of it all cut through whatever fog he was in. He managed a small, tight smile. "It's big," he said, and it was the most engaged thing he'd said all morning. We joined the river of people flowing into the terminal. The air buzzed with a dozen different languages, the clatter of suitcase wheels on polished concrete, the cheerful directives from cruise staff. We checked our main bags, and that simple act, handing over our mundane lives to be delivered to a stateroom, felt symbolic. We were free. We were down to our carry-ons, our passports, and our tickets. We got in line for security. This was it. The final threshold. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a mix of exhilaration and a last, lingering thread of fear. I was so close. We inched forward. I could see the gangway ahead, the official waiting to scan tickets, the opening that led directly onto the shimmering deck. I could smell the ocean. I turned to Mark, a genuine, unstoppable smile finally breaking through on my face. We're really doing this. I reached for his hand. His hand was ice cold, and it was then I saw the look on his face. It wasn't a headache. It wasn't stress. It was pure, unadulterated dread. His skin was pale, waxy. A fine sheen of sweat beaded on his forehead. He was staring past me at the gangway, but he wasn't seeing a vacation. He was looking into the mouth of a monster. "Mark," I said, my smile fading. "Honey, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." He didn't answer. He just stood there, frozen, as the line moved forward without us. The joy, the noise, the color of the terminal. It all seemed to recede, fading into a muffled blur. In that small, silent space that suddenly existed just around the two of us, the dream began to fracture. The postponement of our happiness, which had been a vague, unspoken fear in the car, was now a tangible, cold presence standing right beside us. The line shuffled forward. The couple in front of us, wearing matching his and hers tropical shirts, handed over their tickets with giddy laughter. The electronic scanner beeped its approval, a sound of finality and passage. They disappeared into the shaded mouth of the gangway, their voices fading as they stepped onto the ship itself. They were in. We were next. This was the moment. The culmination of all those weeks of dreaming, of planning, of desperately hoping. I held our 2 tickets in my hand. They weren't just pieces of paper. They were passports to salvation, to sunlight, to us. I took a small step forward, my body already leaning into the movement, ready to cross that final threshold. The sounds of the terminal, the echoing announcements, the calypso music from the ship's speakers, the happy din of the crowd, all coalesced into a single, uplifting hum in my ears. I could almost feel the gentle vibration of the ship's engines through the soles of my sandals, a promise of imminent departure. I turned my head slightly to share this perfect, triumphant moment with Mark. The smile was already on my face, my eyes crinkling, ready to meet his. But he wasn't there beside me. He was a half step behind, rooted to the spot. The color had completely drained from his face, leaving a sickly, grayish pallor. The slight sheen of sweat I'd noticed moments before was now a full, clammy dampness on his skin, plastering his hair to his forehead. His eyes were wide, but they weren't seeing the cheerful cruise staff or the gleaming ship. They were fixed on some horrible, internal horizon, glazed with a terror so profound it stopped my heart mid-beat. "Mark!" The word came out as a whisper, my smile dissolving into confusion. "What is it?" The woman at the scanner smiled patiently, her hand outstretched for our tickets. "Whenever you're ready, folks." That's when his hand shot out. It wasn't a gentle touch. It was a grasp. His fingers, cold and trembling, closed around my bare upper arm with a startling urgency. The pressure wasn't painful, but it was firm, absolute. It was an anchor, preventing me from moving another inch. "Claire." He said my name, but his voice was unrecognizable. It was a low, ragged, strained thing, stripped of all its usual timbre, scraped raw from some deep internal place. It was the voice of a man in the grip of a primal instinct. The terminal didn't just get quiet. It went completely, utterly silent. The music, the announcements, the chatter of 1,000 people. It all vanished, swallowed by a high-pitched ringing in my ears. My world shrank down to the desperate look in his eyes, the cold pressure of his fingers on my skin, and the 2 brightly colored tickets, now feeling absurd and useless, in my hand. "We can't go," he breathed, the words barely audible but hitting me with the force of a physical blow. "I can't do this. I'm so sorry. We have to turn back." Time didn't just slow down. It fractured. I could see every detail with hyperreal clarity. The confused frown of the ticket scanner, the impatient shift in posture of the man in line behind us, a single drop of sweat tracing a path down Mark's temple, the garish pattern on the matching shirts of the couple now safely on board. 1,000 thoughts tried to form and died instantly. Asterisk, is he sick? Is he having a heart attack? What is happening? Asterisk, but beneath the shock, a darker, more terrifying understanding began to dawn. This wasn't physical illness. This was a refusal, a rejection, not just of the trip, but of my dream, of my desperate plan to save us, of me. The humiliation came first, a hot, crimson wave that burned my cheeks and neck. Everyone was staring. I could feel their eyes, their pity, their confusion. Then came the anger, white-hot and blinding. After everything, after the months of gray silence, after my hopeful planning, after I'd poured all my hope into this one single thing, he was doing this now, here at the very gate. But the anger was instantly drowned by a heartbreak so vast, so devastating. It felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. The sound that escaped my lips wasn't a sob. It was a small, broken gasp, the sound of air leaving a corpse. The tickets fell from my numb fingers, fluttering to the polished floor like dead leaves. I didn't fight him. I had no will left. The dream was dead, murdered at the altar of whatever demon had him in its grip. My body went limp. I was a puppet with its strings cut. I let him turn me around, his hand still vice-like on my arm, now less a restraint and more the only thing holding me upright. I didn't see the terminal. I didn't see the people. I was a ghost, being led away from the promise of life, back into the gray. And as we stumbled away, a sound cut through the muffled silence in my head. The ship's horn. It blew, long and deep and triumphant. It wasn't a farewell. To me, in that moment, it was the sound of my own dream sailing away without me. The walk back through the terminal was a waking nightmare. It felt like walking against a powerful current. A river of happy, excited people flowed relentlessly towards the ship, their faces alight with anticipation, while we were two grim statues being carried backwards into a bleak and unwanted reality. I kept my head down, my hair forming a curtain to hide my face, but I could feel their eyes, the curious glances, the whispered questions, the pity. Each one was a tiny, sharp needle jabbing into my raw, exposed nerve endings. The colorful souvenirs in the shop windows now seemed to mock me. The sound of reggae music was a cruel joke. He didn't say a word. His grip on my arm had loosened from its desperate clamp to a mere guide, but it felt like a brand. He moved with a singular, grim purpose, his jaw set, his eyes fixed straight ahead, seeing nothing but the path to the exit. He was a man fleeing a crime scene, and I was the damning evidence he was dragging along with him. We reached the car in the massive parking garage. The air was cold and smelled of concrete and exhaust fumes. The silence between us was no longer just an absence of sound. It was a physical, suffocating entity, filling the space inside the vehicle, pressing in on us from all sides. He started the engine, and the mundane, familiar sound of it was somehow the most devastating thing yet. It was the sound of normalcy returning, a life sentence of gray silence being reaffirmed. He pulled out of the parking spot and began the slow descent down the spiral ramps of the garage. Each turn, each level we went down, felt like a descent deeper into a personal hell. With every rotation, the glimpse of the bright, open sky and the distant, towering funnel of the ship, my ship, grew smaller and smaller, until finally, it vanished from view entirely. That's when the dam broke. It started not with a sob, but with a tremor, a fine, uncontrollable shaking in my hands that traveled up my arms and seized my entire body. My breath hitched, a ragged, ugly sound in the silent car. And then the tears came. They weren't the delicate, pretty tears of a movie scene. They were a storm. They were hot and relentless, pouring down my face, dripping off my chin, soaking the front of my shirt. I made no effort to stop them or hide them. What was the point? The dream was dead. Why bother with dignity? The confusion was a tornado in my mind. whirling with fragmented, desperate questions I couldn't voice. Asterisk why? Why would he do this? What possible reason could be enough for this? Is it me? Has he fallen out of love with me? Is there someone else? Is he in some kind of trouble? Asterisk each unanswered question was another twist of the knife. Then the anger surged, white-hot and vicious, cutting through the grief. I finally found my voice, but it wasn't my own. It was a strangled, venomous thing, shredded by tears. Look at me, Mark. Look at me. I choked out. He flinched but kept his eyes glued to the road, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. What was that? I demanded, the volume rising with hysterical energy. What in God's name was that? You humiliated me. You humiliated us. After all of it, the planning, the money, the hope, you just stop? You couldn't have said something yesterday? This morning? An hour ago? You had to wait until we were literally about to step onto the ship to have this meltdown. I was screaming now, the words tearing my throat raw. The car felt tiny, the walls closing in. You owe me an explanation. You owe me words. Any words. Give me something. Anything. But he just drove. His silence in the face of my torrential rage was a louder, more devastating response than any words could ever have been. It was a wall, impenetrable, final. The anger burned itself out as quickly as it had flared, leaving me hollowed out and empty, collapsing back into the passenger seat. The tears continued, but silently now, a ceaseless, despairing river. I turned my face to the window, watching the industrial outskirts of the port city blur past. Warehouses, freight trucks, smokestacks. A landscape of grim functionality. A perfect mirror of the wasteland my life had become. The miles stretched on, each one a hammer blow, nailing the coffin of our relationship shut. I didn't just feel like we weren't going on a cruise. I felt, with a certainty that chilled me to my soul, that we were over. Whatever fragile thread had still been holding us together had been severed on that dock with the brutal efficiency of a guillotine. He had chosen his silence, his mysterious dread, over me, over us. The car was filled with the sound of my ragged breathing and the hum of the tires on the asphalt. A funeral dirge for a dream that had died just feet from salvation. The car pulled into the driveway of our home, and the sight of it, the familiar gray siding, the dormant flower beds, the empty porch, felt like a profound personal failure. This wasn't a return. It was a retreat, a surrender. We had left this house hours ago with suitcases packed with possibility, and we were slinking back to it emptier than when we'd left. The engine cut, and the sudden silence was deafening. It was the silence of a vacuum, of a space where something monumental had just died. Neither of us moved. We just sat there, strapped into our seats, prisoners in the metal and glass capsule of our shared misery. I could feel the phantom vibration of the ship's engines still in my bones, a cruel echo of the journey we weren't on. He finally moved first, unclipping his seatbelt with a sharp, definitive click that made me jump. The sound was like a period at the end of a sentence I never wanted to be written. He got out, closed his door, and walked to the trunk to retrieve our bags without a single glance in my direction. I watched him through the window, his movements robotic, devoid of any emotion. He was just performing a task, the task of coming home. I somehow found the strength to unbuckle my own belt and push the door open. The February air hit my tear-streaked face, a cold, indifferent slap. I walked to the front door, my body heavy, as if I were moving through water. He held the door open for me, a hollow gesture of courtesy that felt more insulting than if he'd let it slam in my face. Stepping back inside was the worst part. The house was exactly as we'd left it, but it felt completely different. It was no longer just a house that was quiet. It was a house that was empty of hope. The morning's frantic energy was gone, replaced by a stale, chilling stillness. The coffee mugs we'd rushed out the door were still in the sink. The colorful cruise brochure was still on the kitchen table, its vibrant images now a sickening mockery. He carried our suitcases upstairs. I heard the dull thud of them being set down in the bedroom, not unpacked, just discarded. Like the dream itself, I stood, rooted in the middle of the living room, hugging myself, listening to the sound of him moving around upstairs. Every sound was amplified in the silence. The creak of a floorboard, a drawer being opened and shut. The quiet, devastating normalcy of it all was unbearable. He came back down, his footsteps heavy on the stairs. He paused at the bottom, and for one wild, foolish second, I thought he would finally break. That he would turn to me, his face crumpled with apology, and explain this terrible, awful thing he had done. But he didn't. He walked into the kitchen, filled a glass with water, and drank it leaning against the counter, staring out the window at the gray backyard. The distance between us in that open-plan room felt infinite. We were two continents, separated by an ocean of unspeakable things. I couldn't stand it. The silence was a physical pressure on my eardrums, on my heart. I had to break it or I would shatter into a million pieces. So that's it. My voice was hoarse, raspy from crying. It sounded alien in the quiet room. You dragged me away from the one thing I was looking forward to, the one thing I thought might actually help us. You watch me completely fall apart, and you have nothing to say? You're just going to get a glass of water. He didn't turn around. His shoulders tensed slightly, but he kept staring out that window. What do you want me to say, Claire? His voice was flat, exhausted, utterly drained. It was the voice of a man who had already given up. I want you to tell me why, I pleaded, the hysteria bubbling up again. I deserve that much. Give me a reason. Any reason. Make me understand. He was silent for so long I didn't think he would answer. Then, he spoke, so softly I almost didn't hear him. I can't. And with those two words, he killed the last flicker of hope inside me. Can't. Not I won't. I can't. It was an admission of a prison I knew nothing about, a barrier I couldn't see and would never be allowed to cross. He finally turned from the window. His eyes met mine, and for the first time I saw it wasn't just emptiness there. It was a deep, bottomless pain. But it was a pain he was refusing to share. He was locking himself away with it, and he was locking me out. Without another word, he walked past me, went into the study, and closed the door. Not slammed it, closed it. A quiet, gentle, final sound. I stood alone in the silent living room, the brochure still smiling up from the table. The silence was no longer just between us. It had solidified into a wall. He was on one side with his unspeakable reason, and I was on the other in the empty house with absolutely nothing. The silence in the house was absolute. It was a living thing, thick and heavy, smothering every corner. I stood in the center of the living room for what felt like an eternity, just listening to the deafening absence of sound. The closed study door was a monument to our failure, a physical manifestation of the chasm that had exploded between us. I couldn't bear it. I couldn't stand there in the shrine of my own shattered expectations. I needed noise. I needed something, anything, to drown out the screaming questions in my head. My hand, trembling slightly, fumbled for the remote control on the coffee table, my fingers brushing against the glossy, taunting surface of the cruise brochure. I pointed it at the television and pressed the power button. The screen flared to life with a burst of garish color and obnoxiously cheerful sound. A game show. Contestants were jumping up and down, screaming with joy over winning a new car. The sheer, unadulterated normalcy of it was so bizarre, so violently out of sync with the cataclysm that had just happened in my own life, that I could only stare, numb and uncomprehending. How could the world just continue? How could people be laughing and winning cars when my entire world had ended in a parking garage? I jabbed at the channel button, a frantic, desperate need for distraction driving me. News. A local politician giving a speech. Weather. A forecast for more gray skies. A sitcom. A laugh track that felt like needles in my ears. Another news channel. A commercial for soap. I kept pressing the button, the channels flashing by in a meaningless blur of light and sound. And then I stopped. The screen was filled with a familiar, terrifying sight. Water. Churning, violent, dark water. But it wasn't a nature documentary. The graphic in the corner of the screen wasn't a whale or a shark. It was a news station's logo, and emblazoned over the footage in a stark, bold, blood-red banner were the words, "Breaking news." My breath caught in my throat. The remote slipped from my numb fingers and clattered onto the floor. The camera shot was shaky, taken from a helicopter or a Coast Guard vessel. It zoomed in through a mist of rain and spray on a scene of utter chaos. A ship, a massive, listing cruise ship, tilting at a horrifying, unnatural angle against a backdrop of a furious, steel-gray sea. Its white hull was scarred and dark, a gaping, monstrous tear visible near the waterline. Lifeboats, tiny and desperate, were being lowered into towering waves that threatened to swallow them whole. The distorted, frantic voice of a news anchor cut through the howl of the wind. Asterisk. Reports are still coming in, but we are receiving confirmed footage of a major maritime disaster. The MS Azure Serenade, a cruise liner departing from Bayport just hours ago, has reportedly collided with a submerged cargo container lost in a storm further out to sea. The impact is said to have been catastrophic, breaching multiple hull compartments. Asterisk. The Azure Serenade. The name hit me like a physical punch to the solar plexus, knocking the air from my lungs. My legs gave way, and I crumpled onto the edge of the sofa, my body gone cold and leaden. I couldn't move, couldn't blink. I could only stare, frozen in a state of pure, uncomprehending shock. The screen split. On one side, the horrific live footage. On the other, a pristine, smiling promotional photo of the ship I had been standing in front of just hours ago. The same ship I had desperately yearned to board. The same deck I had imagined myself dancing on. It was now a scene of pandemonium and terror. Asterisk. Declaring a mass casualty event. Coast Guard and emergency services from multiple jurisdictions are responding, but conditions are extremely hazardous with high winds and... Asterisk. The words began to blur, morphing into a meaningless drone. The world around me, the silent house, the gray light from the window, the closed study door, all of it faded into a distant, muffled haze. The only thing that was real, horrifyingly, vividly real, was the image on that screen. My mind, reeling and shattered, began to perform a bizarre, slow-motion calculus. It started connecting impossible dots. Mark's silence, his distance, the dread, the panic, the desperate, last-second refusal to board. The look of pure, unadulterated terror on his face that I had mistaken for a rejection of me. It wasn't about me. It had never been about me. A sound escaped my lips, a small, choked whimper that was drowned out by the frantic news report. My hand rose slowly, trembling violently, and covered my mouth. My eyes, wide with a dawning, terrifying understanding, remained locked on the television screen, on the name of the ship that was now synonymous with disaster. The news banner flashed again, updating with new, horrifying text, feared significant loss of life. And in that moment, the foundation of my entire reality didn't just crack. It vaporized. The anger, the humiliation, the heartbreak, it all vanished, incinerated in the white-hot fire of a terrifying, unbelievable, impossible truth. He knew. Somehow he knew. The frantic, disembodied voice of the news anchor continued to spill from the television, detailing the unfolding horror, the desperate rescue efforts, the names of towns whose hospitals were on standby, the terrifying statistics of the ship's passenger capacity. But the words were just noise now, a distant, chaotic soundtrack to the absolute stillness that had enveloped me. My entire being was focused on one thing, the closed door of the study. The anger was gone. The self-pity was gone. All that remained was a cold clarity so sharp it was almost painful. I slowly, mechanically, reached for the remote control that had fallen to the floor and pressed the mute button. The sudden silence that rushed back into the room was even more profound than before, but now it was charged with a new electric meaning. I stood up. My legs felt weak, but they held. I didn't run. I walked. Each step across the living room carpet was deliberate, measured. I was moving through a world that had been completely remade in the space of 3 minutes. The The gray light from the window wasn't gloomy anymore. It was sacred. The walls of this house weren't a prison. They were a sanctuary. The closed door wasn't a rejection. It was a shield. I stopped in front of the study door. I didn't knock. I simply turned the knob and pushed it open. He was sitting in the old leather armchair in the corner, not at his desk. He was slumped forward, his elbows on his knees, his face buried completely in his hands. His shoulders were shaking with silent, ragged sobs that he was trying desperately to stifle. The sight of him, this strong, silent, stoic man utterly broken, shattered the last of my own defenses. He heard me come in and flinched, but he didn't look up. He seemed to curl in on himself further, bracing for the onslaught of my fury, the deserved accusations he believed were coming. I walked over and slowly knelt on the floor in front of his chair. The worn Persian rug was rough against my knees. I reached out and placed my hand gently on his forearm. His skin was cold. Mark. His name was barely a whisper, but it echoed in the quiet room. He shuddered at my touch, at the softness in my voice, a tone he hadn't heard from me in months. Slowly, painfully, he lifted his head. His face was ravaged. His eyes were red-rimmed and swimming with a pain so deep it was like looking into an abyss. Tears had carved clean tracks through the stress and sweat of the day. He looked ancient, exhausted, and utterly terrified. "I saw the news," I said softly, my own eyes filling with tears now, not of sorrow, but of an overwhelming, awe-filled gratitude. A fresh wave of agony crossed his face. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He tried again, his voice a broken, rasping thing. I'm so sorry, Claire. I'm so sorry for all of it. For the silence. For on the dock. I must have hurt you so much." The words tumbled out, choked and desperate. I couldn't get on that ship." "Why?" I asked, my hand tightening on his arm. "Tell me, please." He took a great, shuddering breath, as if steeling himself to confess to a crime. He looked at me, and for the first time in a year he truly saw me. He let me all the way in. "This morning," he began, his voice trembling, "when I was in the shower, I had this feeling. It wasn't a thought. It was a physical thing. A coldness right in the center of my chest. It was pure animal dread. And a voice in my head, not my own, screaming an oh. Not a whisper. A scream." He wiped a hand across his face. I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was anxiety, stupid pre-travel jitters. I got dressed. I packed. I got in the car. But with every mile we got closer to that port, the feeling got worse. It was a weight crushing me. In the terminal, with all the noise and the people, it was deafening. That feeling, that scream in my head. His eyes glazed over, reliving the moment. When we were in line, when I saw the gangway, it wasn't a doorway anymore. It looked like a mouth, a dark mouth. And the feeling, it wasn't a feeling anymore. It was a certainty, a knowledge, as certain as I know my own name. If we stepped onto that ship, we would die. A sob escaped him. "How do you say that? How do you look at the woman you love and tell her you're canceling the dream vacation because you have a bad feeling? You'd think I'd lost my mind." I thought I was losing my mind, so I said nothing. I shut down. I couldn't explain it. I could only act on it. And I knew that in stopping you, I was probably destroying us. I had to choose between looking like a crazy person and losing you, or getting on that ship and losing you forever. I chose the pain I understood. He finally looked at me, his expression raw with a vulnerability I hadn't seen in him since we were kids. "Ishos US. Even if it meant you hating me, I chose a world where you were still alive to hate me." The truth of it settled over me, immense and humbling. It wasn't logic. It wasn't a reason. It was something deeper, something ancient and primal that he had listened to. A gut feeling. A whisper from the universe. A nightmare he'd had while awake. My own tears fell then, hot and cleansing. I didn't see a coward or a distant husband. I saw a man who had been handed an impossible burden. I saw a man who had stood between me and a nightmare, taking my anger and my hatred onto himself to save my life. "You saved us?" I breathed, the words filled with a reverence I had never felt before. And for the first time that day I reached for him. Not to stop him, but to hold him. I wrapped my arms around his neck and pulled him to me, burying my face in his shoulder. He collapsed into the embrace, his body shaking with the force of his relief and delayed terror. We clung to each other, kneeling on the floor of the study, not as two estranged satellites, but as a single, united force, bound together by a secret knowledge of a fate we had narrowly, miraculously, escaped. The silence in the house was no longer a wall. It was a sanctuary, and it was finally, blessedly, shared. We eventually moved from the floor of the study to the couch, drawn by the silent, flickering images on the television screen. We didn't turn the sound back on. We didn't need to. The horror unfolding in high definition was a language that needed no translation. We sat side by side, my hand clasped tightly in his, our fingers laced together as if we were holding on against a tremendous gale. The physical connection was no longer just for comfort. It was an anchor, a constant tactile reassurance that we were both here, we were both safe, we were both real. The initial shock began to recede, replaced by a heavier, more somber weight. The news channels cycled through the same few pieces of footage. The listing ship, the frantic lifeboats, the desperate faces of people being hauled onto rescue vessels, wrapped in shock blankets, their eyes wide with a trauma we could only imagine. Then the graphic would change. A smiling, happy family photo would appear on the screen. A photo taken just yesterday, at this very port, no doubt. A couple on their honeymoon. A group of friends celebrating a retirement. A grandmother surrounded by her beaming grandchildren. Missing, the Henderson family of Omaha, NE, the caption would read. And just like that, the abstract tragedy became agonizingly personal. A deep, profound sorrow began to well up inside me. A grief so vast it felt like its own ocean. These weren't just statistics scrolling at the bottom of the screen. They were people. People who had stood in the same line we had. People who had felt the same excitement I'd felt, who had dreamed the same dreams. They had scanned their tickets, walked up that gangway, and stepped into a nightmare. I thought of the couple in the matching tropical shirts, the ones who had gone right before us. Their giddy laughter echoed in my memory, now sounding horribly fragile and final. Were they safe? Were they clinging to a piece of debris in that freezing water? Were they on that list of missing souls? That could have been us? I whispered, the words catching in my throat. The reality of it was a physical blow. We should be on that screen. Our photos, our families. I couldn't finish the thought. The idea of my mother, my sisters, seeing my smiling face flash under the word missing was too much to bear. Mark's grip on my hand tightened. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. I could feel the same devastating tremor of awareness moving through him. He had felt the premonition, but now he was seeing the concrete, horrific result of it. The weight of his decision, of the burden he had carried alone, settled onto his shoulders, and I saw him physically sag under it. This was the paradox of our miracle. Our salvation was inextricably tied to the utter devastation of hundreds of others. Our incredible luck was built on a foundation of their unimaginable loss. The guilt was a swift and silent predator. Why us? Why were we spared? What made us so special? There was no answer. There was only the cruel, random wheel of fate, and we had somehow stumbled off its crushing path while others were obliterated by it. We sat there for hours, watching in silence as the sun set outside our window, casting long, deep shadows across the room. The news moved from live rescue footage to talking heads, to press conferences with grim-faced officials. The death toll estimates began to appear, numbers that started low and then, with a sickening inevitability, began to climb. Each number was a person, a story, a life extinguished. I cried then, not for myself and not for us. I cried for the strangers, for the Henderson family of Omaha, for the honeymooners, for the retired friends, for the grandmother. I cried for the joy that had been so brutally snuffed out. I cried for the families waiting by their phones, their hopes slowly curdling into despair. I cried for the sheer, awful fragility of it all. How a dream could be vaporized in an instant. How the line between a future of sunlight and a future of darkness could be so infinitesimally thin. We mourned them together, in the quiet of our living room. We honored them by bearing witness to their tragedy, by feeling the full, awful depth of it. Our miracle had come at a terrifying cost, and to cheapen it by focusing only on our own relief felt like a betrayal of those who were lost. We had been given a second chance that thousands of others would never get. The weight of that responsibility, of that debt to the universe, settled over us, heavy and profound. We were alive, and we now had to figure out what to do with that gift. The news played on a continuous, silent loop throughout the night, a ghostly blue light flickering against the walls of our dark living room. We never turned the sound back on. We didn't need the repetitive commentary to understand the scale of the tragedy. We just sat, together, watching the world learn about the disaster we had narrowly avoided. At some point, exhaustion overtook us, and we fell into a fitful, tangled sleep on the couch, still holding on to each other as if the world itself might tilt and try to throw us off. I woke first. A thin, weak winter light was filtering through the blinds. For a single, disorienting second, the previous day felt like a bizarre, terrible dream. And then my eyes focused on the television, frozen on a news station's menu screen. The words, Azura Serenade Disaster, still starkly visible. It was all real. I carefully extracted myself from Mark's embrace. His face, even in sleep, etched with a deep exhaustion and the remnants of terror. I walked to the window and pulled up the blind. The world outside looked exactly the same. The same gray sky, the same dormant trees, the same quiet street. And yet it was utterly, fundamentally different. It was as if the lens through which I viewed everything had been wiped clean. The colors, though still muted, seemed deeper. The air I breathed felt sharper, more precious. The silent, material evidence of our abandoned life was everywhere. The suitcases by the stairs, the cruise brochure on the coffee table. But these objects had lost their power. They were no longer symbols of a failed dream or a broken marriage. They were relics, artifacts from a life that had ended yesterday afternoon on a dock. The woman who had packed those suitcases with such desperate hope was gone. The man who had driven to the port in silent dread was gone. I heard a soft movement behind me. Mark was awake, sitting up on the couch watching me. His eyes were clear now, but filled with a quiet, awestruck solemnity. The wall was gone. The distance had evaporated. We had looked into the same abyss together, and it had fused us back into a single unit. "Good morning," I said, my voice soft. "Is it?" he asked, his gaze flicking to the frozen TV screen. I followed his look and then turned back to the window. "Yes," I said, and I meant it with every fiber of my being. "It is. It's a morning we weren't supposed to have." I walked over to the coffee table, picked up the glossy brochure, and looked at it for a long moment. The smiling couples, the pristine decks, the brilliant blue water. It no longer represented a fantasy. It represented a tomb. I didn't crumple it or tear it up in anger. I simply carried it to the recycling bin and dropped it in. It was a gesture of letting go, of accepting the new reality. I turned to face him. "We have been given a second chance that none of those people got," I said, my voice steady. "We have to earn it. We can't just go back to before." He stood up and crossed the room to me, taking both my hands in his. His were warm now. "I know," he said. "The silence, the distance. I was lost, Claire. In my own head, with all the pressure, the stress. I built a wall and I didn't know how to tear it down. I thought I was protecting you by keeping it all in. But I was starving us. And I was so busy planning a fantasy future," I admitted, "that I stopped trying to fix our real present." We stood there in the quiet morning light, in our safe, solid house on solid ground, and we talked. We didn't talk about the leaky faucet or the gutters. We talked about the things that mattered. We talked about his fear of failure at work. We talked about my loneliness, We talked about the terrifying, unexplainable intuition that had saved our lives. We made a promise, right there, to never again dismiss the other's feelings, no matter how irrational they seemed. The grand, dramatic gesture of a cruise ship hadn't saved us. It had almost killed us. Our salvation was found in the quiet, messy, terrifying, and ultimately miraculous moments right here in our own home. The healing wouldn't be found in a 7-day itinerary. It would be found in 1,000 small, conscious choices to be present, to be open, to be grateful for the mundane miracle of another day together. The world outside was still gray. Problems hadn't vanished. But the lens had changed. The color hadn't returned to the world. The blindness had left our eyes. We could see the value in the gray, the profound beauty in the simple, solid fact of being alive. We had been pulled back from the precipice, and we would never again take for granted the sacred, solid ground beneath our feet. Our new beginning started not with a fanfare, but with a whisper of gratitude, in the quiet of a morning we were never meant to see.